Saturday, March the 14th, 1981, Shabbat Zachor. Please turn in the Sidurim to page 67. The blue traditional prayer books on page 67. We have been pursuing a course of endeavoring to understand the meaning of a section of our traditional liturgy, namely the Shacharit service, following a tradition laid down by the founder of the synagogue, Mordechai Kaplan, manifested particularly in his very important book, The Meaning of God in Modern Jewish Life, where instead of dealing with Jewish theology, Jewish philosophy, Jewish ideology, Jewish concepts, Jewish values in the abstract through a process which is usually called systematic theology, that is to say, dealing with abstract ideas, rather approaching organic aspects of Jewish life. In the case of the meaning of God in modern Jewish religion, Rabbi Kaplan applied his interpretive devices to the Sabbaths and the festivals. That is to say, the argument was, if we want to understand what it means to be Jewish, we want to make those distinctions and definitions which help us to understand and clarify more what it means to be Jewish. It is better to try to understand those values within the living context of their organic framework than to try to take them out of that framework and deal with them in a systematic, abstract way. So that instead of dealing with the question of freedom or creativity or salvation by themselves, these ideas are instead dealt with in the context, for example, of the Shabbat or a Pesach or Shavuot or Sukkot. We are endeavoring to understand parts of the traditional liturgy, which, unlike the modern versions of the prayer book, which are fractured versions of the past, still represents for many Jews an organic whole, even to this day, and certainly for the past 1,000 years or more represented the same kind of organicity in Jewish liturgical life as the Sabbath did in Jewish communal life. We've been studying the meaning of the question of the unity of God. Why were the Jews so insistent upon stressing the unity of God? And it's interesting to note that before the affirmation of unity, which we've been spending considerable time on, namely the polemic affirmation on page 71, in which our ancestors refused to accept the prevailing dualisms or Trinitarianisms of the age in which they lived, insisted that God was responsible for everything, that there was only one principle in the world. That immediately before that affirmation, the Jew read quite a large section from the Torah, namely the song that was sung by the Israelites when they crossed the Red Sea. The fact that this is a large chunk from the Torah in itself should draw our attention to its seriousness, its centrality of purpose in the thinking of our ancestors. The liturgy, of course, as a whole, the entire prayer book, is largely based on the Bible. at a rough estimate, 95 or maybe even a higher percent of the prayers are either verbatim chunks of the Torah, of the Jewish Bible, taken out lock, stock and barrel and placed in the prayer book. For example, the Pesukei de Zimra, those psalms which are read every morning, Sabbaths, festivals and weekdays, are simply taken from the book of Psalms and placed in the prayer book. Other prayers are simply pastiches, mosaics, collections of verses taken from different parts of the Bible and strung together in the form of a theme. But each verse in itself comes from the Bible. Even the blessings that are recited, like the blessings in the beginning of the Shacharit, like Asher Natan Lasech Revina Lahavchin Ben Yom Vein Laila, blessing God for giving the cock the wisdom to distinguish between day and night. The very words in which that blessing is couched is biblical. For example, the phrase Noten Lasech Revina, which is the nucleus of the blessing, is a biblical quotation. So not only are global organic sections of the Bible used in the liturgy, not only are prayers built up as mosaics by simply adding separate individual verses from the Bible together, but phrases from the Bible are even used in the new liturgical compositions, so that the liturgy is veritably Bible-drenched. Now, there are three sections to the Jewish Bible: the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im, the Ketuvim, what is incorrectly called the Law, or the 5 books of Moses, the prophets, from which we read on Sabbath mornings, and the writings, or the hagiographer. On one level, they all partake of the same level of holiness, but on another level, the central writing, of course, is the 5 books of Moses in the Ark. And so when we find that we are in the face of readings from the Torah, as opposed to readings from Nevi'im and Ketuvim, we may be certain we are in the presence of ideas, concepts and values which our ancestors wished to stress and which were possessed of great importance for them and which we do well to try to understand. From various archaeological evidence, it would appear that the earliest forms of Jewish worship before the Christian era consisted very simply of studying in conjunction with Psalms, the Shema, and the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments are published, are found in the morning service, but they are tucked away at the very end. I don't want you to take anything just on my word, so let's see if I can find the 10 Commandments. They are on page 151. They have been relegated to the back of the book because when Christianity began, the Christians insisted that of all the 613 mitzvot, only the 10 Commandments were important and the others could be dispensed with. As a polemical device, the Jews who had, to that point, in their worship both in synagogue and temple, given the 10 Commandments a central role, stopped reciting the 10 Commandments in synagogue. It's an interesting propaganda ploy which the Anti-Defamation League should study in great depth. In other words, instead of entering into any kind of argument as to who was right and who was wrong, the Jews simply stopped doing it. The same thing is probably true of the custom of kneeling. When Christians also began to kneel, the Jews stopped kneeling, with the exception of the kneeling which takes place on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur in connection with the Aleinu prayer. So one of the central parts of the Torah obviously had to be the 10 Commandments. That was relegated to the end. Another part of the Bible which was read, which you've already noted, was at the very beginning of the Shacharit service, the story of the binding of Isaac on page 19 in the prayer book, if you just want to glance at it. The story of the binding of Isaac. Orthodox Jews to this day read that as part of the morning service, also from the Torah, and one does not have to draw any attention to the central importance of the Akedah. It's interesting to note, if we look at this, that for the Orthodox Jew, for the traditional Jew, coming to Shul on Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, wasn't such a mind-blowing event, because most of the material he was using every single day of the year. That is to say, the festivals picked up and intensified themes that were quotidian concerns of the traditional Jew. The binding of Isaac, about which we make such a fuss each year and try to find a new nuance and a new interpretation, was read every single morning. The Ten Commandments were read every single morning. I remember my father sitting in synagogue after the service was over reading the Ten Commandments, because everybody was hopping and rushing to get away to business. And my father, being the rabbi, of course, had nothing else to do except daven. And therefore he stayed behind and read the Ten Commandments vicariously for everybody else, which of course is what rabbis do with their time. They just daven all day long vicariously for everybody else. Well, that's in response to the question of what do rabbis do with their time, which I'm constantly asked. They simply daven all the stuff that you don't daven. You see, somebody has to do it. One person has to go through everything. And there's a lot, so it takes a long time. You're barely through with it by dinner time. You have to start all over again. The crossing of the Shema, of course, is read, and that the Shema has been extremely important, and one does not have to stress the fact that part of the importance is that it refers to what became interpreted as the importance of wearing tefillin and tzitzit. That is to say, the identification marks of the Jew. Whatever our modern feelings about how Jewish we want to be, we must be in no doubt about the fact that traditionally the Jew has supposed to stick out like a sore thumb. People have had to know what the Jew looked like. He was not supposed to be wearing Brooks Brothers suits or ties, or in fact, to be perfectly frank, looking the way we look. We don't look Jewish. Jews were supposed to be very conspicuously Jewish, sartorially, tonsorially, every other way orially. The Israelites were redeemed from Egypt, the Midrash says, Shelo shinu et shemam, v'lo shinu et leshonam, v'lo shinu et malbusham. The Israelites were redeemed from Egypt on three grounds, for three reasons. Because they didn't change their name. Kandinsky remained Kandinsky and didn't become Smith. It's a very simple thing. I'm a fine one to talk. Where do you think Miller came from? We have no idea, but it certainly wasn't there when the Jews left Egypt. They didn't change their name. They didn't feel the need to become like Gentiles. They didn't feel the need to cut off the Polish and the Russian and the German and all the other and become more whatever, British, American, French. They didn't change their language. They still kept the Mamaloshan, whatever it was. It certainly couldn't have been in Yiddish in those days. It must have been Gyptish or something, some kind of amalgam between Hebrew and the local vernacular. And they didn't change their clothes. This does not mean that Jews were averse to showering. Teenagers, please note. It meant simply that they didn't change their garb. They dressed the way Jews dressed, namely, traditionally speaking, always at least 250 years behind the times. That is to say, the garb of the Chassid is the garb of a Polish Gentile nobleman of the 17th century. But the Jew has to wait 300 years before he can... I always think it's a Jewish habit to wait until a movie comes to the New Yorker and not to see it when it first comes up the East Side. It's kind of a tradition not to wait until it's been around for a while. It fits in with this pattern. Now, not only do we read the song of the crossing of the Red Sea, but we stand up for it. So that although, since Passover is coming, and this particular reading is picked up. You see, it's curious. You look at this, how the Shacharit becomes like the overture of a Wagner opera. Every leitmotif that is going to appear in the opera is already manifest in the overture, or at least, since strictly speaking, I don't think Wagner buffs would agree that Wagner has overtures. They sort of blend into the main opera. But certainly the first few moments of the opera have... Look what we have here. In the reading of the binding of Isaac, we have the leitmotif which is picked up on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. In the reading of the Ten Commandments, we have the leitmotif which is picked up on Shavuot, Pentecost, which celebrates the revelation of Mount Sinai. In the story of the crossing of the Red Sea, we have the leitmotif which leads to seventh day of Passover, when the song of the crossing of the Red Sea is actually sung. In other words, all of this, and then when we add to this the Shema, and the idea of the totafot b'neinecha, the phylacteries, the tefillin on the head and on the arm, and the tzitzit, you have your Jewish soldier in battle fatigues, that is to say, visibly and manifestly dressed for war of survival against the Gentiles. The Jew dressed in his battle fatigues, carrying all his paraphernalia in order to survive, together with the little book in which all the central themes of survival are there for him. with that, with his uniform, and with his spiritual weapons, and with his handbook, which contains all the propaganda themes which he must recite over and over and over again if he is to perform the duty of, in Yiddish, what we say, red sich ein, to keep on convincing himself that being Jewish is bigger and better and best than anybody else. And we had a need to keep on telling ourselves that we were bigger and better and best than everybody else, because nobody else felt so. Nobody else acted so. So it was very important that we kept our ideas very clear in this our uniform. This is the image of the Jew as he leaves the synagogue any morning after having recited the morning service. He has in cameo, he has in a nutshell anticipated, adumbrated the entire liturgical cycle. That is to say, I think we've not missed one out, but we didn't draw attention clearly enough to the fact that this early reading of the binding of Isaac includes the question of the firstborns that were offered up in Egypt. Let's just look at that. Unless this is not printed in this book. Yes, on page 9. On page 9. Here you have an anticipation of the reading on Passover. In fact, we read this on the opening days of Passover. The Haggadah is anticipated on page 9. The Haggadah is anticipated on page 9. V'higaddata levincha bayom hahu lemor, thou shalt tell thy son on that day, saying, Ba'avur zeh, on account of this, of what the Lord did for me when I left Egypt. Every major Jewish festival is anticipated in the Shacharit service. Every major motif in the Jewish year is adumbrated in the Shacharit service. Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot. And as I say, added to this, the uniform of the Jew. This is very important for us to stress. The talit and the tefillin were not meant to be worn as rituals inside the house. You were meant to be visible. In ancient Israel, the tefillin were worn all day long in public. Many Orthodox Jews to this day don't take off their tefillin after the service, but they sit down for a while and they study with their tefillin on. And as you know, many Jews still walk around the streets with their tzitzit hanging out visibly and manifestly, that it may be known, uri temoto, that both you shall see and remember the words of God, but more importantly, that the Gentiles shall notice you. All of these, including circumcision, are of the same pattern as those African tribes that gouge holes in the faces of their children and then rub soil and sand in to make quite sure that they will be conspicuously marked to the end of their days. In other words, all of these are ways and means of identifying the Jew and giving the Jew a sense of identity. Who am I? That the Jew may know wherever he is and whatever he is doing that he is Jewish. The fear was that as soon as you stop being part of the group, as soon as you stop coming to synagogue, as soon as you stop wearing these clothes, as soon as you stop rehearsing these themes and leitmotifs, assimilation sets in, and the Jew gradually dissipates. There is no question of the wisdom of this spiritual architecture of our ancestors. The only question is how much we can tolerate today when we are also living in another civilization and have other concerns and preoccupations. Having said that, the way in which the Jew manages to balance the needs of tradition, the needs of his groups of survival, and his own personal needs on that will depend the future survival of the Jewish people and its quality. Now, we're particularly concerned, since we're interested in the question of the unity of God, with the story of the crossing of the Red Sea. Why was this read in such a central position? Why were the Ten Commandments put aside? Why was the reading about telling your children about what happened when you left Egypt, the importance of the Akedah story, the binding of Isaac, even the Shema, which has a central point, except we don't stand for the Shema. For this we stand. Of all the readings from the Torah, the Song of Moses maintained centrality of place and pride of place. It is clear that it was not just a question of the exodus from Egypt. It was not just a question of the plagues which the Egyptians suffered. It's not just a question of the greatness of Moses or the revelation of Mount Sinai. What we have here is a central myth which one does not have to be too smart to realize speaks of some kind of a birth via a form of baptism. That is to say, the Egyptians are drowned in the Red Sea, they don't make it. The Israelites walk through and come out the other side. Here we have this image of this mass of water which God divides, and the Israelites emerge victoriously and then sing this song. But the song also describes how the Egyptians are drowned and destroyed in the Red Sea. What are we to make of this idea? It's quite clear that behind this image is the amniotic fluid. This is the story of birth. Children who are born are able to survive in water, and there is the parting of the waters, and they emerge and they live. If you don't make it, you don't live. There is an idea, a central idea that, and incidentally, it's not accidentally at all that the New Testament picks up on this notion and speaks of Israel as having been baptized in the Red Sea. This is a powerful image, as if God picked up the entire Jewish people and did to them what John the Baptist did in the Jordan. They weren't physically dunked, but there is this sense that Israel truly and only became a nation when they left Egypt, and crucially not just left Egypt, but when they got to that point of no theological return, the crossing of the Red Sea, which was the prelude to the revelation of Mount Sinai. It's very difficult, of course, for those of you who are here for the first time to understand what I'm saying. I always face this problem. Obviously, it's my obligation to speak to the people who come every week. I try to balance the two. Let me just say very briefly what the complication is. All of us who did not have an intensive Jewish education naively assume that what happens in the Bible, is what happened. And we follow the sequence of Adam and Eve and Noah and Abraham, Isaac and Jacob and so on and so forth, right to the destruction of the temple. Unfortunately, the story of the Bible was not written as it was going along. It was written very much after the event. That is to say, it was not until our ancestors lost their land. This is somewhat oversimplifying, because what really happened was that the fermenting process, which began to generate the biblical process, began as soon as the spiritual leaders of the people saw the writing on the wall. This happened in the middle of the 9th pre-Christian century, some 400 years before the temple was in fact destroyed. In other words, in the same way that William Blake was able to anticipate the meaning of the Industrial Revolution on the basis of one smoking factory chimney, and on the same way that a sensitive artist is able to anticipate a change in the mood of an entire civilization by one or two examples of certain phenomena, so also the geniuses who left us the Bible smelt a political rat in the middle of the 9th pre-Christian century. That rat was called Assyria, that was moving for a Mediterranean outlet. And we're aware that ultimately all those small tribes and nations, the Phoenicians, the Edomites, the Amorites, the Moabites, who had been able to flourish in a brief period of a political vacuum when neither Egypt nor Babylon was interested in Palestine, ultimately would be wiped out. That is to say, we came into existence as a people in a brief, what do they call those things when you send up a spacecraft, window. There was a little window available for a brief period of time between the 10th and the 8th pre-Christian century when Egypt lost interest in Palestine, and therefore these little groups could suddenly spawn. But when Assyria finally moved to the Mediterranean, all of those principalities were destroyed, save only our ancestors, and not all of them. 10/12 of them were destroyed, like the Phoenicians and the Moabites and the Ammonites and the Edomites. Judah, the two remaining tribes, decided to evolve a method of living and a method of thinking. It's no good blaming them because we're stuck with it. Who knows what we would have done at that time? The alternatives were either roll over and die or generate a new way of living, what we would call today an adaptational method of survival. And that was when the biblical process began, beginning with the 9th pre-Christian century and culminating in the 5th pre-Christian century, when we first have the Torah in existence, plus the writings of the prophets. And so what happened then was that the history of the Jewish people was rewritten in terms of now. Had there not been an exodus from Egypt, the stories of Abraham would have been lost completely. Had the temple not been destroyed, the modern Israelites would be like Italians and Greeks today, conscious that they once had a rich historical heritage, but totally different from what had happened in the past. We decided to opt out of that fate. We decided to live under unlivable conditions. That's why we're so meshuggah. That is to say, we decided to live without a land, without a navy, without an army, and without an air force, with a one God. There's no question in my mind that the stress on the unity of God, the absolute insistence that wherever you were in the world, the same God ruled. And wherever you were in the world, whether good things or bad things happened to you, it all came from the same source, was part of this adaptational mutation. But there are other aspects which we keep on finding which simply endorse this perspective. So very briefly, what I'm saying is that this idea of the sequence from the exile to Egypt, the exodus from Egypt, the crossing of the Red Sea, the revelation of Mount Sinai, which all reads as if it is an A, B, C, D, E, F, G kind of history, beginning, middle, end, in fact is the result of the reworking of countless generations of a much later date, using material that would have been totally forgotten had it not been for those later events. It's very much like having lived in the same block in Brooklyn as a nice young lady whom one only meets 15 years later at Cornell, and fall in love and decide to get married. At that point, the fact that you lived in the same block in Brooklyn becomes of supreme importance. But if you didn't meet that person and didn't decide to get married, then that particular fact that she happened to live on the same block in Brooklyn would be of no historical significance whatsoever. If you want to understand why the patriarchal stories became important, it was because of what happened afterwards, not of what happened before. There was a need to provide a greater and a richer pedigree, and this is in fact what happened. So, what is it then that our ancestors were stressing? They were stressing that the exodus from Egypt was the point when Israel became a nation. And in fact, that is the meaning of Passover. Passover celebrates the birthday of the Jewish people. Abraham may be called somewhat incorrectly in the books that we give to our children, Ha-Yehudi Harishon, the first Jew, but that's nonsense. First of all, the word Jew is an anachronism before 586, before the Common Era. And secondly, until the exodus from Egypt, there was no Jewish people or Israelite group or people. That is when the people is fused into a unity. And their first affirmation is this sense of having been baptized, of having been born, of having emerged from the womb, of having become separate. And separation becomes the central theme of Jewish life. The idea of separation, of differentiation, of distinction, of making distinctions, becomes the unique quality of Jewish thinking. That is a central theme in the Jewish ability to survive. Jews make differences, and nothing can be greater than the difference of being born and not being born, being separate from the mother and not being separate from the mother. And we know that in the sphere of mythology this was not just an accident, because in fact this represented a revolution in the ancient world, especially in terms of Egypt, where the notion prevailed that men and gods and nature were all part of the same identical womb-like substance. That is to say, the central theme of Egyptian thought, as with all pagan thought, but particularly Egypt, was that there are no distinctions. God is man, and man is God, and God is the sun, or the ocean, or the cow. That is to say, there is an interchangeability. An interchangeability. The scholars give it the name, the doctrine of consubstantiality. All is of the same substance. Nothing could be further from the Jewish perspective. Havdalah, hamavdil, ben kodesh l'chol, ben or la'choshech, ben Yisrael la'amim, ben yom hashvi'i l'sheshet yemei ha'maseh. This again is a prayer recited on the Sabbath, in which we bless God for making a havdalah, a separation between sacred and profane. Light and darkness, the seventh day and the rest of the week, Israel and the rest of the world. And one of the most centrally and important themes that came out of the Exodus from Egypt, which is picked up by the fact that as soon as this song of the crossing of the Red Sea is over, God is referred to over and over again as King, was a revolution in Jewish life, of which we have very little evidence, but which it seems to me must have been taking place at this time, the transformation of worshipping God in the guise of a mother into worshipping God in the guise of a father. This is one of the most obscure chapters of Jewish history, but all the evidence seems to indicate that in the ancient Near East, the worship of the mother goddess was widespread, that it slowly broke down, and we can watch it breaking down in the ancient myths, Hesiod's Theogony, the Babylonian creation story, that one of the reasons being given is that there was some socio-economic changes, that the economic role of woman as hunter and gatherer no longer was of prime importance, and because of this socio-economic shift, men began to assume more power. We see this metamorphosis very conspicuously in an 8th pre-Christian Greek text, Hesiod's Theogony, which is, Hesiod is a contemporary of Amos. Hesiod, that is to say, is a contemporary of the biblical process in Jewish life. And in Hesiod, we have the story beginning with Gaia, or Earth, being the central goddess, and at the end we have Zeus, father of gods and men. And as if to put the lid on it, in the end of the book, Athena, the goddess of justice, is born from the head of Zeus, as if to say that the womb has been read out of central significance. One only has to think of those figurines that keep on cropping up in archaeological research in the ancient Near East, which stress the womb as the most central part of the female body. Those grotesque, elongated figures where the sexuality of the Great Mother is stressed out of all proportion, to realize how far culture had come when Athena could be conceived as being born from the head of Zeus. I suppose one could accuse me today of being, if I may use the phrase of a charming, impending, forthcoming new member of our congregation, relentlessly intellectual. I never mean to be relentlessly intellectual. It's just that one cannot understand these things without seeing them in their historical perspective. Well, let me try to be less relentlessly intellectual for a brief moment. On Thursday, I went to visit Blanche Ehrenstein, who is really doing very remarkably in hospital. I want to thank all those of you who sent cards to her independently. Some of you who don't even know Blanche sent cards to her, and I thank you. I know who you are. And she was very surprised, and I told her who you were. She said, but why are they sending me cards if they don't know me? And I explained to her that at the SAJ, we know people even when we don't know people. And I still ask those of you who would like to communicate with Blanche to do so. The operation was postponed for various reasons, and she'll be having surgery next week. At any rate, she was with her grandson, Joel, who's a charming young man who had just come from a rally outside the United Nations. And I didn't know about these things. I'm too busy trying to be a rabbi to know what's happening in the Jewish world. And Joel told me that there were thousands upon thousands of Hasidim parading outside the United Nations. I said, why? And he showed me two cuttings from Jerusalem newspapers. One was of a chassid with tefillin and talis being dragged along the ground by two Israeli police. And the other was a story of tear gas bombs being thrown into a synagogue in Mea Sha'arim, the home of the Notori Karta, some days ago. It may have been last Shabbat for all I know. It certainly didn't get to my attention in any other way. and the rally outside the United Nations was on the part of these Hasidim. That is to say, they were protesting the entrance of Israeli police into their sacred places of worship. Many of you must know that the Notori Karta, which is an Aramaic word which is means those who guard the city, Shomrei Ha'ir, in Aramaic Notori Karta, comes from a verse in Psalms, Al Chomotaich Yerushalayim Hifkadeti Shomrim. On thy walls, O Jerusalem, have I appointed watchmen. The Notori Karta are a unique phenomenon in Jewish life. They and their ilk do not accept the existence of the state of Israel. They do not speak Hebrew, they still speak Yiddish. They do not use Israeli currency. They do not use Israeli utilities. They have nothing to do with the Israeli government. They believe that Zionism is a Jewish heresy, and they are not alone in thinking that. One of the problems of surviving as Jews in the 20th century is that the old organic truths don't really help us anymore. And all I try to do here is to endeavor to clarify for you the options. I don't tell anybody what to do, except like coming to Purim in fancy dress, of course. But in terms of what to do in terms of these issues, these are very complicated issues. At any rate, it was a very eventful evening. First of all, there was a fire alarm, and I had visions of towering inferno. Rabbi gets fried on the 15th floor of New York University Medical Center. And I thought Jerry Lowenstein was playing games. There was apparently some fire in Kips Bay. This is America, and the smoke got carried to the ventilation system of New York University Medical Center, so the whole hospital came to a stop, and the elevator stopped working, and I had a lecture to give. But finally I managed to. But that wasn't the end of the complications. Having survived this mock fire alarm with thousands of firemen running around on all the floors and the elevators stopping, because anybody who's seen Towering Inferno will remember the elevator is the worst thing to use when there's a fire in the building, and there was a very powerful smell of smoke. Get outside, miss the floor, and don't get off at the number one, but get off at the ground level. And since the fireman in the elevator, whom I told a sob story, I was a rabbi on the way to giving a lecture, so he let me down, get out onto 34th Street and find myself in a sea of Hasidim. Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way. 10,000 saw I at a glance, nodding their payas. I'm joking, but I'm not joking. It was a traumatic experience. It was a traumatic experience. Now, what happened within the next few moments, I tried to get a cab, and I couldn't get a cab at that corner because I was late for my lecture, and I ran down to the next block, and there was a Chinese man, only in New York, there's a Chinese man driving this cab, and it had off-duty. My principle of survival in New York is never to believe anything that I see. A cab that says it's ready for hacking could be off-duty if the guy doesn't like your face, and a cab that is off-duty is on-duty if you smile in the right way. So I grabbed the door, and as I grabbed the door near the street, a chassid grabbed the door on the other side. It was a little bit like the story of the prophets of Baal and the prophets of Yahweh on the top of Mount Carmel. Who would be the one whom the god of the taxi cab industry would at any rate, I got in because the Chinese cab driver locked the door where the chassid was trying to get into, and because I wasn't wearing a hat or any other the accoutrement of the chassidut, he let me in. Now, this Chinese driver was not an anti-Semite. He said to me, "I don't want to let the Jewish gentleman in." Well, I had a real moral problem. It happened to me once that my wife and I were going down Madison Avenue in a cab to some friend's house, and the cab driver was a racist and began to go on and on and on about what he thinks ought to be done to black people. Now, I'm very pugilistic, especially on Saturday night, especially after a couple of dry martinis. I was ready to stop the cab and open the door and have the police come and arrest this man. My wife, who feels that I have poor impulse control, and she has a point, a large point, grabbed my arm and said, if you say a word, I'm not going to go out with you tonight or something. So, but I was faced with this moral problem. What do you do when you're in a cab and somebody begins becoming a bigot? I mean, you lose an opportunity of at least letting him know that you're not on his side. Now, I really had a moral problem, but he wasn't being anti-Semitic. I asked him to clarify. He said, I know where these Jewish gentlemen come from. All these Jewish gentlemen come from Brooklyn. And I don't want to go to Brooklyn right now because it's a rush hour, and if I go to Brooklyn, I won't get a... that wasn't anti-Semitism, that was good business sense. In other words, he wouldn't have done it for an Eskimo. He wouldn't have taken an Eskimo to Brooklyn at that point. So I didn't feel the need to say, well, you know, this is my card, I'm a Reconstructionist rabbi, and any Saturday morning... If you... I was carrying in my briefcase a paper by a former teacher of mine, which is part of a series of papers in a relatively new area in the study of mythology, which we are partaking of in the synagogue because it happens to be an area which I've been interested in for the last 10-15 years. It was not until the beginning of the 1960s that psychoanalysts began to apply analytical theory creatively via ego-psychological methods to the question of myths. And the conclusion they came to was revolutionary. There are only 2 or 3 articles that I know in the literature that really address themselves to this issue. And this paper was one of them, and I'm working on an aspect of this from the standpoint of Judaism. That is to say, what is the function and purpose of myth? The answer is that myth is adaptational. In the same way that people develop defense mechanisms in order to protect themselves in certain contexts, the kind of stories that ethnic groups tell each other within themselves, among themselves, the kind of stories that religious, ethnic, traditional groups transmit from one generation to the next are not just things that actually happened. The things that actually happen in life are so unimportant as to be, they don't even bother these people. It's not what actually happened which is important, but what might have happened and what ought to have happened and what should happen. That is to say, it is the ideal and the value rather than the facticity of what happens is important. And what we discovered was that in the same way that if a particular piece of pathology comes before one and one says, well, at what point in the psychosexual development of the person that is sitting or standing in front of me did this particular problem crop up? At what particular stage? At what particular era did this become an issue so that in a later stage, when a crisis cropped up, this was the point which was latched onto as a means of survival, as a mechanism of survival. We say also to the group, how is it? What was it in the history of the Jewish people that made certain central Jewish values and myths of supreme importance? Why was it, for example, that the Jews told the Oedipal myth in the way it appears in the Bible? Why didn't they tell the Oedipal myth in the form, for example, of Jack and the Beanstalk, who goes up this stalk and kills the giant, or whether he kills the giant or the giant falls off, breaks his neck? There are various versions of this. Or why didn't the Jews tell the story as the Greeks told the story of Prometheus? They're all versions of the Oedipal story. Prometheus who steals fire from the Titans. And because of his liberating of humanity is condemned to be chained to a rock in the Caucasus and have his liver consumed daily. It seems to me that the liver would have made a marvelous Jewish insight. We could have built all sorts of traditional themes around the liver, which plays such a central role in Jewish food customs. I mean, imagine that would be the reason why we have chopped liver, you know. Chopped liver, zu she'ano ochlim al shumma, you know. How did the Jews deal with the Oedipus problem? They had Moses wearing a yarmulke go up to Mount Sinai and get a Bible like a bar mitzvah boy with God patting him on the head. In other words, if you were going to live as a nation without a land and without an army and without a navy and without an air force, you couldn't let your hair down. You couldn't afford to have intergenerational fights. Jewish young males couldn't indulge themselves in what young Jewish males can afford to indulge themselves in today, in respect of rebellion, in respect of doing their own thing. The transmission from one generation to the next had to be in mutuality and in accord. And the way that was established was by transmitting the central story in Jewish life that this, the most priceless jewel, the functional equivalent of the fire which Prometheus stole from the Titans, the hen that lays the golden eggs, was not stolen by Moses as the son, but was given with a full heart by God the Father, the authoritarian Father, to the child who does not question that authority. I tell you, that's why Jews are so crazy today, because when this sort of thing breaks down, you've got a lot of Jews running around with problems. As long as it works, it's marvelous. But once it breaks down, we've got trouble. And that's what we have today. And that's why we have to understand a little more about where these ideas come from. And there I was with this sea of Hasidim. And I want you to know, ladies and gentlemen, that they meant business. I wouldn't like to meet them on a dark night in Brooklyn. They might not be physically violent, but they could make you feel very small. There was a ruthlessness and there was a determination. I have never seen so many Hasidim together in one group, and they are determined. Whatever they are up to, they are determined. And I had this paper, which is an endeavor to explain a cycle of Greek myths relating to Hercules. It's a paper that's going to be given very shortly, one of the institutes. Now, the question that's asked there is, at what point of the development of the Greek people would the need be to deal with the question of the power stemming from the mother in this particular way? It relates to the cycle of myths around Hercules or Heracles. That is to say, depending on the particular phase of development, and some cultures develop more quickly than others, and some remain on a plateau for a greater length of time, certain kinds of myths will become centrally important because they satisfy a particular need at a particular point in time. And it suddenly became clear to me that these ultra-Orthodox Hasidim are the last remnants of those of our ancestors who replaced the ancient mother goddess with the patriarchal authoritarian father god. All the rest of us are heretics. Let me try to explain what this insight means. You have to go back, you see, to the 9th, 10th pre-Christian century, to the point we began some time ago, and say, here we have several small groups who have gotten themselves a place in the sun in Palestine because no other major power is interested in pushing them out of the way. Then Assyria, from the 9th pre-Christian century, begins to show an interest in that part of the country. All those small peoples, including the northern kingdom of Israel, disappear like the morning dew. Alone, those who live in Judah, the 2 southern tribes, witnessing what is going on about them, decide to survive against all odds. A mutation takes place. An adaptation takes place in the way in which the Jews think. Henceforth, they will no longer be a sovereign people living on their own soil like other peoples, fighting battles like other peoples, maintaining their national survival the way other peoples maintain their national survival. Henceforth, the Jews will be a people set apart. They will not live in history because they will not be able to survive in history. They will live outside of history, and that is where the Naturi Karta live, outside of history. All the rest of us, to a greater or lesser extent, have gone back, and going back presents us with enormous problems. It's funny that in Hospital Blanche, when she heard this discussion between me and Joel, reminded both of us that her father, who was a devoutly Orthodox Jew, when he heard of what was going on in connection with Zionism, momentarily elapsed and said, "Good luck to these guys," in Yiddish. You see, although according to him only the Messiah could take the Jews back to the Promised Land, and anything apart from that was heresy, most of us felt that being a homeless Jew was such a pain to bear that anything that could alleviate it would be better than nothing. Unfortunately, we're really faced with very serious problems. Many of you must have seen a picture in Newsweek of one of the Salvador right-wing reactionaries lovingly fondling a stubby machine gun. The identity of that machine gun is Uzi. And the moral problem, which I as a rabbi am faced with, when I see weapons created in the state of Israel in the hands of right-wing fascists in Latin American totalitarian regimes, is a problem which is going to haunt the Jewish people for the next 1,000 years. that we who created the notion, out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, are providing weapons which are being used to mow down innocent men, women, and children, as innocent as the Jews, men, women, and children who were wiped out by the Nazis during the Second World War. This is one of the terrible prices the Jew has had to pay for going back to the soil. The soil, you see, represents the mother. And what the Jews decided in the 9th pre-Christian century, I'm using the word Jewish, I shouldn't really, it's an anachronism at that stage, the Hebrews. And it wasn't, of course, decided at a committee meeting, because nothing of this order is ever decided at a committee meeting. It's something that unconsciously developed in the collective feeling of the people, obviously mediated through individuals, but ultimately mediated through the collective historical sense of awareness of the group, that the surefire way to disappear as a people was to become wedded to soil. The surefire way to die out and be destroyed would be to be wedded to land. And therefore, there began that awful, painful process of the Jew emancipating himself from land. Mipnei chata'enu galinu mi'artzenu. We now are exiled from our land because of our sins, and we will never get that land back again until God, in the fullness of time, not Ben Gurion, sends the Messiah and brings us back to the promised land. This is a painful topic to talk about, and I know that some of you can't listen to me when I talk on this topic. But I have to, because unless we understand what's going on, we're not going to understand what to do. The reason why sometimes we have to be intellectually relentless is because unless we understand what we are doing as Jews today and what certain things mean, what certain kinds of behavior mean. I am trying to understand a certain piece of behavior I saw in New York City on Thursday night. Thousands of Hasidim with the kind of determination on their face which led Jews to be burnt at the stake in Spain reciting Shema Yisrael. Hasidim, the same kind of Hasidim who walked into the gas chambers singing Ani Ma'amin Be'emunah Shlema Beviat HaMashiach. I believe that the Messiah will come, and even though he tarry, nevertheless, I believe that he will come. And what were they protesting? They were protesting Zionism. What they were saying, although of course they would never have couched themselves in this fashion, and in a kind of a fantasy conversation that might have taken place had the Chinaman not locked the right-hand door, and both Chassid and Reconstructionist Rabbi got into the cab and for the next 20 blocks exchanged thoughts on what was going on, might have been like this. This Chassid might have said to me, Miller, you're all wet. You have no understanding of what it means to advance Judaism or to enable Jewish survival. You guys don't understand that we had to leave Egypt. We had to separate from all that wombness, all that consubstantiality. We had to insist that there was a separation between God and man and nature, and above all between the Jew and his land. Because the land, Eretz Moledet, is the mother. And once the Jew becomes too preoccupied with the land, he will never be able to cope with the concept of diaspora. That is why many Israeli Jews find the diaspora almost impossible to understand. Ben Gurion couldn't understand it. That is to say, you have to make the break from the mother totally and completely. And so when we look at the Jewish people and we say, at what particular stage of development, what is the functional equivalent in the development of the child, the development of the human being, which is echoed at the point at which the Jews fix their central myth. And there is no question in my mind that it takes place at the point where the Jew realized that unless he could be totally emancipated from Mother Earth and only dream of returning to Mother Earth at the end of time, which stopped it from being a real problem in real life, so that the Messiah becomes a very interesting play on the notion of incest. It's not without accident that the Messiah stems from a long line which begins in incest, Judah and Tamar producing Peretz. Nor is it alien to the notion which the mystics have stressed, that when the time for the Messiah comes, the Torah will be abrogated. when the Shabtai Tzvi debacle was over, some of the Jewish communities anticipated the coming of the Messiah. And if you want to know what happened, you better read Gershom Scholem. The first thing that went was sexual mores. That is to say, it is quite clear that what the Jew is protecting himself from is the emotional feeling that links him to the mother. And these Hasidim know that. That is why in their circles the distinction between male and female is the greatest distinction of all. And if we only think that that is bigotry, and the only reason why they're not training women rabbis in Brooklyn is because they're not good feminists and they're not this and that and the other, we will be deluding ourselves. There is a crucially, centrally important ideological theme which affects us also here. And I don't know the answer to the questions that I'm raising. All I know is that they are real questions, and we better think about them, because our survival depends on them. That is to say, now we have another dimension to the meaning of the unity of God, which I really didn't understand before Thursday night, although I had all the little bits and pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, but I didn't know what it was that kept it together. When the Jews realized that they were not going to be able to continue to live as a people with a land, they had to make a very big decision. They said, is it possible that if we create a mythological land, a never land, could we do it? It's, it's as simple as this. There are some children where their mothers go out on Saturday night, are inconsolable, and the mothers cannot leave. There are some children who are able to let their mothers go and can transfer their feelings for the babysitter. What the Jews had to accomplish was that kind of phenomenon and that kind of developmental process. The Jew had to make a break from a incestuous relationship to the land, such as characterized by the Canaanite fertility worshippers, which explains why the prophets were so violently opposed to the Canaanite fertility rites. The Jew had to make the kind of adjustment in his collective thinking so that he could accept any kind of terrestrial babysitter, whether it was France, or Germany, or Italy, or Asia Minor, or Spain. Wherever the Jew would be permitted to go, he had to be able to adapt and accept a new babysitter. Otherwise he wouldn't have survived. It was essential for the Jew to be able to live anywhere in the world if this strange diaspora people was going to survive. And what kept them together was not an actual land, but a dreamland. A dream which has been punctured by the harsh realities of the 20th century. When on the Seder the traditional Jew said L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem, he was not thinking about anything like Teddy Connick's Jerusalem. And this is no reflection either on his theology or Teddy Connick's Jerusalem, which is a very, very beautiful city. It was a Jerusalem not of this world. It was a Yerushalayim Shel Mala. It was a transcendental Jerusalem. And so here we Jews are schizophrenically fractured between these two irreconcilable modes of existence. There are two kinds of Jew in the world today, and two kinds of thinking. And it's not just Chassid against Zionist, it cuts right through even Zionist thinking. Because among those who will be speaking tomorrow afternoon at this very important Israeli Perspectives program sponsored by the Dutch Education Committee, which I hope you will attend, there will be many who would have been able to understand what we are talking about this morning. Now, the fact that one has gone back to a land to build a national life in itself is neither good nor bad from the point of view that we're talking. What is bad is when the relationship to the land, the relationship to the soil, becomes pagan. This is what Richard Rubenstein acknowledges has happened and welcomes. I neither welcome it nor not welcome it. I'm still trying to understand it. It's very confusing. We are at that point in the history of an ongoing historical group which has recollections going back over 3,000 years. We are at that point when a major shift is taking place in our mythological certainties. And it's a very difficult time to be alive in. It's hard enough when one is an individual, and after a lot of time and effort realizes that the ways in which one has adapted and survived in the past have simply not been good enough, that they are self-defeating, that new conditions in life suggests that to respond to these new conditions the way one responded when one was 5 and a sibling was born simply is not going to help. That new methods of adaptation are necessary in order for one to survive. And in a sense, of course, Reconstructionism was such an attempt. It hasn't caught on yet, because in many respects I don't think the central myth of Reconstructionism is ever going to work, namely that the Jewish diaspora world over will be organized into voluntary communities. I can't see the Jews do anything voluntarily anyway from that point of view. Voluntary, democratic, self-governing. Can you imagine where the SAJ would be in such a Jewish community? We'd be out in the street, and I'd be driving a cab, deciding whether or not to take Jewish gentlemen to Brooklyn or not. The fact of the matter is that this is a pipe dream, the idea of autonomous Jewish communities, because that's the sort of thing that Jews do only when they have to do it, when it's forced upon them. And the question now, and of course, Zion, or the Jews in Israel, was going to be the center of this enormous wheel, the hub, the Jewish community in Israel, and so on and so forth. Let me just try to sum up in a nutshell what I'm trying to say. The crossing of the Red Sea is symbolic affirmation on the part of our ancestors that the only way for the Jew to survive is to separate radically and dramatically from mother. That unless the Jew can learn to transfer his loyalty to other lands and to other territories, he will never be able to survive. From that point of view, the notion of living in two civilizations helps us to some extent. What it doesn't help us to do is to cope with the problem of those Jews who have gone back to Israel, not in Kaplan's sense, feeling that they are part of a wider Jewish community with a sense of interplay and mutuality, but with a need to think only in terms of the motherland, and the need to think in terms of survival on that motherland, using whatever methods and whatever mechanisms are necessary, regardless of how diametrically opposed those methods may be to the time-tested values of Jewish survival. Would anybody like to respond or disagree or argue, or would any Jewish gentleman or ask a question for clarification? Yes.
I had a pleasure to enjoy a few results in those last 5 to 6 weeks. But I had little critics. I think that questions are okay, especially existentialistic questions, but they're also looking for answers. Maybe that the limit between reconstructionism and destructionism may be quite thin.
The gentleman is saying that it's not good enough to ask questions, we have to give answers, and that therefore the distance between reconstructionism and destructionism, if I heard him correctly, isn't that great. I hear the question, and I respect the emotion which generates it. I mentioned before that these are topics which are very unpleasant to deal with. I really wish I didn't have to mention the fact of that picture in Newsweek magazine. I'd much rather ignore it. I'd much rather stress something else more positive. Unfortunately, it's like the story of the lady who was a little pregnant. You can't be a little pregnant. You are pregnant or you're not. And when a central ideological shift in Jewish behavior in the terms of survival is manifest so publicly, we have to ask ourselves where we stand. Now, I can see that certain people would feel that in a synagogue a rabbi ought to give answers, and I make no bones about saying I don't have answers. There are synagogues where answers are given. That's all I can say. There are undoubtedly synagogues where answers are given. We here have found over the years that these questions are simply too complex, and therefore I prefer to raise questions. Linda. No. Linda, to me it wouldn't have made any difference whatsoever. I'm almost surprised that you asked the question. It wouldn't have made any difference, because I feel that I feel that the fact that when the Jews became a nation, it was something that the Jews had dreamed of for thousands of years. This kind of arms industry, as I see it, is so antithetical to everything we stood for that it's almost as if it's a different kind of Jewish people. I felt with the Hasidim on Thursday night as if I didn't belong to this group. They seemed totally alien. I feel the same way when I see reports about what's happening in terms of the arms race in the Middle East. Yes?
Translate Amavdi ben Kodesh L'Kol, several times said the difference between the holy and the profane. I find that a little troublesome. I mean, I can understand that Shabbat is holy, but why not at least refer to the rest of the week as ordinary or perhaps mundane? It kind of puts a very pejorative connotation to what we do all week, and I don't think that
I accept your criticism, Joel. I was busy trying to remember the prayer and translate it at the same time. That's no argument. Kodesh and Chol, sacred and secular. Would that be acceptable to you?
Sure. But people have translated it in exactly the same words, and I can never understand.
Well, it simply means the difference between those times when we're occupied in earning a living and those times when we gather together to share the collective ongoing spiritual concerns of the Jewish people. Kaplan would say holiness means very important in terms of Jewish value survival. So I'll accept sacred and secular. Yeah, yes.
When you were discussing the Hasidim, at least what I gathered was that you were implying that they were carrying on Jewish tradition and that their fanaticism, although extremely uncomfortable for the rest of us, was perhaps necessary. But what I see with the Hasidim as they throw stones on Shabbat and Mea She'arim is a perversion of Jewish tradition. Perhaps we're perverting it too. I don't deny that many of the things that we, mean those of us who are not Hasidim, and I certainly am not, do are perhaps a perversion. But I don't think that they are carrying it on. I think that the ruthlessness that the Hasidim, the modern Hasidim show, is totally alien to Judaism as the machine gun.
Yes, that's a very good point. I tell you, see, one of the things that interests me about the modern world is that it's so ancient. And one of the things that fascinates me about the ancient world is that it's so modern. We talk about the mother goddess. All you have to do is to look at any newsstand. I mean, let's be honest with ourselves. Any newsstand today, the pornography that greets us at every single block down Broadway, I mean, what else is that if not on some rather cheap level? Obviously, one has to understand that the Canaanite fertility rites were not what they are described as being in the Bible. You know, there was higher and lower. The tendency in Jewish tradition, like in other traditions, is to compare the best in Judaism with the worst in the opposition. I would say the Mother Goddess is doing very nicely on the front pages of Playboy and Penthouse these days. That is to say, the archetype, the notion that God is as close to one as one's genitals, which was the central theme of the pagan fertility rites, is all over the place. That is to say, it's very relevant. I constantly teach courses on mythology, and the first thing I try to teach my students is to bring in pieces from the daily newspapers and magazines which are current functional equivalents of the ancient themes. My fascination with the Hasidim was that they too represented part of Jewish history that I would care to forget. This total insistence on patriarchy, a ruthlessly masculine God, and the implications, that is to say, a total separation in the Jew between intellect and emotion, and a total negation of nature. Cynthia Ozick, in her own fictional way, wrote a novel called The Pagan Rabbi, in which she tried to wrestle with the very themes that I am wrestling with this morning. And I must tell you that she didn't give any answers either. It's a very confusing book. The rabbi ends by committing suicide or being strangled on this tree, but it's not quite clear whether he's done himself in by his own fanaticism or what. The point that you make is a very good point. I am not endorsing Hasidism. I'm simply saying it is alive, and it is well, and it is kicking, and we shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking that it's an antediluvian, outmoded way of thinking. These men and women produce 8, 10, 12 children per family, I know. Their birth rate is going to grow. Reconstructionists do not procreate as much, although hopefully now that Cindy and Robert are getting married, we will be able to stem the tide of zero population growth at the SAJ, and I really feel that there's something, you're promising me just one, but that's not enough, that's just perpetuation. The point that you make is excellent. I do not endorse rock throwing at Jews who drive in Meir Shalim on Shabbat, but I'm also opposed to Israeli police throwing gas canisters into synagogues for whatever reason. For whatever reason. It would be unthinkable on Fifth Avenue if people did it in St. Patrick's Cathedral, no matter what Catholics were doing. And that's something that worries me. But what I want to be quite clear about is I'm presenting it to you as an aspect of the living representation of Jews who believe ruthlessly in God the Father and ought to be considered as a balance to what we hear on the other side, as if all this is in the past and we shouldn't worry about it anymore. I don't know. I'm beginning to have second thoughts about certain things even on the political level. Some friend of mine shoved a copy of the Harvard Business Review into my hands last night, in which Norman Podhoretz, I thought people were going to react the way they do on Purim when the name of Haman is mentioned. Norman Podhoretz speaks about the intellectuals for capitalism. It's an article I'd rather not have read. It worries me because I find some of what is being said there very, very satisfying. I mean, if you drive on the subway at all, or if you walk through the streets of Manhattan, or you jog to the park, you begin to wonder whether this welfare statism we have in America is the best way of solving our problems. We've poured so much money into so many institutions, and we're adding to the postal rate. Something seems to be wrong. So these guys who are coming along and saying, how about back to the 19th century jungle? Let the capitalists fight it out among themselves. They'll be much more charitable, and maybe somebody will renovate the park and put some new turf down in Sheep Meadow. I don't know. It's a very seductive thought. One doesn't have to agree, but one ought to understand what is going on. These ideas are cropping up. Michael and then Myron. I don't think we're going to have much time for yes, Michael and then Myron.
Something is not responsive to what you were saying politically. What you started with in the beginning has to do with answers. And the juxtaposition in the prayer book between the...
Could you stand, Michael? I think your voice will carry more.
The juxtaposition in the prayer book between the destruction of the Egyptians and the conclusion that God is one, that creates the good and evil. As I was reading it, I was thinking, from the big question all the time that is difficult to answer, why God is one, creates good and evil, is the evil. And as I'm reading that, I'm thinking, well, from the point of view of the Jews, that was a pretty good event. But from the point of view of the Egyptians, that wasn't a very nice thing to happen. And the question of good and evil very often is one it's like a relative question. And that was, it points out, I think, almost, that the question that God creates the good and the evil, to the Egyptians, that's an unexplainable event. To the Jews, it's an explainable event. And putting that in there, in a sense, tells the Jews that the evils are not explainable. They may be explainable from some other point of view other than yours. Just as to the Egyptians, it's not explainable, but to the Jews it is. And it kind of brings, I think, puts in simply this kind of perspective that there is no answer to that question. Maybe we can't accept that, and we don't want to live with that. But that's the only way in which you can continue with that idea, which is so important, that God is one. And that is that there is no answer, and you've got to have faith that there's some other answer that you don't know about.
As a matter of fact, your thoughts were shared by the rabbis who came 300 or 400 years after the episode. The Exodus took place in the 13th pre-Christian century. We're talking about over 1,000 years later. That beautiful midrash, which I'm sure many of you have heard before, in which the story of the crossing of the Red Sea is rewritten. This revisionism takes place constantly, and God is described as rebuking the Israelites for singing the song that I spoke of this morning. And he says to them, Ma'asei Yadai Tovim Bayam, the works of my hands, the Egyptians, are drowning in the sea. How dare you sing songs? So they were aware of this problem. It was good for the Jews, but it wasn't good for the Goyim. So it raises questions. Good and evil is relative. It depends what side of the fence you're looking at. Myron?
I've got a few things.
You better make it just one, Myron, because we're running out of time. And I'm going to ask one of our guests to speak, and that's it.
Well, just two then.
All right.
First thing, that's with the Hasidim.
Yeah.
Whom I think are in very great danger. I I'm just picking up on this, because of the Lubavitcher mobiles, they're coming out and saying to us who are not them, you must be like us. And I always get the feeling that they're justifying their own existence and their own way of life. And I would raise the question about their myths being useful in American society, because it used to be that they're going to say, you can't do this, and you can't watch TV, you can't own this, you can't touch that. And now it's the Hasidim internally who must say to their children that you cannot touch this. It's a reversal. So I raised that question. The real question I had came from a couple of weeks ago, and it had to do with the idea of this development of God. In the adaptational mode, I mean, we realize we have a monotheistic conception by some small party of Hebrews at some point. The question comes up about invisibility. It's always bothered me greatly that the Jews created an invisible God at some point that didn't allow itself to be represented in any physical way. And it connects up with a thing that Kessler writes, and it's a book of essays about the paranoid streak in man. The most important sense for man is his eyesight, is his vision. If you're walking down a building, you're in a building, or sleeping at home, and you smell smoke. For a horse, if it was in there, he would know immediately what's going on. For us, we have to get up out of bed and look around. We have to see with our eyes. The sense of smell is not good enough, the sense of hearing, the sense of touch, and so on. It is vision. And the Jew, in his theology and his ritual, took away the vision. And I asked, do you have to have, first of all, monotheism? Do you have to have an invisible God in order to have monotheism? Can you not allow any kind of physical representation? What is the adaptational use of having an invisible God?
Okay, very briefly. First of all, we must not confuse the Lubavitcher with the Neturei Karta or the Satmara. The Lubavitcher are pro-Zionists. They have a lot of institutions in Israel. The Lubavitcher Rabbi, however, does not live in Israel. He lives in Brooklyn. Their mitzvah mobiles, I don't think they're saying be like us. I think they're just reaching out a hand, and I feel very good about those mitzvah mobiles. I don't feel that they are sort of evangelizing, except in the sense that they want Jews. Whenever I've been approached by some of them, they just want me to perform the mitzvah. They don't ask for money, they don't ask me to go to shul, they just say, do a mitzvah. And I have no objection with that at all. The Satmar and the Neturei Karta are violently opposed to Zionism. All I'm saying is, whether one agrees or not, one ought to try to understand where they're coming from. Very briefly on the subject of invisibility, because I don't want to develop that too long here, I think it's very much the same principle that the Jews try to keep their law oral rather than written. When you fixate God in a particular thing, it gets out of date. It becomes like an idol. When you make God invisible, then nobody can pin it down. There's a kind of a possibility whereby God can always be a function of the highest ethical values of human beings at any particular stage of society. It's a very simplistic answer, but I think that's the reason why I think it was a stroke of genius to say that God is one and invisible, because then one has a kind of an ideal point which one aspires towards, but nobody can stand up in any Jewish circle and say, this is the only conception of God that exists. It's very hard for us Reconstructionists because, we're against supernaturalism, and it's hard for us to say, well, but they also have something to say. But we have to try, impossible, to try to reconcile the opposites, that there is no single viewpoint. And that is why in the Amidah, which we will get to in a few weeks' time, tradition says we don't say Eloheinu, we say Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov. God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob. What does this mean? There were three gods? No, there was one God, but since God is invisible, there were three different experiences of God. Final question, because you're a visitor and you look as if you know Bob, and well, what the hell? I mean, come on.
There's two questions. First of all,
another one with two questions. What is this? Milchik and Fleischik? Can't Jews do anything in once? Go on.
Using the Kriyat Yamsuf as
He means the crossing of the Red Sea.
right, as a parturition image, that's the leaving the womb and entering into a different kind of a theism, away from mother towards father, is very strange in where it's placed. This, in our history, is in fact the gateway of our leaving Egypt and entering the land of Israel, not leaving the land of
Right.
Israel. And it sort of is a very strange place.
Can I just answer that one while you're at it? this is answerable in terms of what I said earlier, that this whole sequence, and in fact the entire myth, was written long after both the Exodus and the entrance to the land. It wasn't just leaving, being born and going to any old land. It was going to a holy land, sojourn on which was conditional on obeying the Torah. That is to say, the myth was actually formulated in this way after the Jews had lost the land, or were on the point of losing it. It's a very...
Writing the image, I would certainly put it at the end.
Well, no, you see, the point was that they felt they'd been given the land and then they'd lost it. Why? And the answer was, you didn't relate to the land the way you should relate to the land. You related to the land as mother, the way the Canaanites, the way the pagans did. You should have realized the land was not mother. The land was contingent upon your behaving morally, not behaving like the Canaanites did. Okay, anyway, we'll pick up that later on. And your second point?
The second point is that the Natura Carta and that entire group, Satmar, etc., really have a very consistent point of view. The problems come in when one recognizes the state of Israel as a state rather than as a group on a parcel of land with no particular claims towards statehood. The problems of statecraft are that states have to behave like states. And in fact, small states have to form alliances with strange bedfellows, South Africa, Iran, other very difficult bed partners. And this is the problem that state of Israel is in. And the reason it's in this shape is because it did not accept the view of the Natura Carta and Satmar.
This is such a complicated problem. I don't want to deal with it here, but sometimes I often say to myself, what would a Nachum Sokolov, what would an Achad Ha'am have done with that picture in Newsweek? I don't know. Achad Ha'am, who thought that Zion was going to be Merkaz Ruchani, the spiritual center. Rabbi Kaplan himself, who draws a radical distinction between the state, which gives him a problem, and the community. You're absolutely right. In order to survive, we have to become like a state. We have to indulge in realpolitik. But then if we do, at least let us recognize that we can't expect the Natura Carta, who still represent the traditional theology, to just go along with it without making a fuss. And we ourselves, on our part, ought to be able to clarify at what point did we give up this particular conception of God? At what point did we give up this particular conception of Jewish history? At what point have we now suddenly entered into a new mythology in which realpolitik survival is the central issue, and the other stuff is okay as long as it doesn't interfere with the strange bedfellow relationships? We have to stop now. We rise for Aleinu on page 192 in the Reconstructionist Prayer Book.